Everybody wanted to check in with a little bit more content from the content minds here on YouTube. A few weeks ago in the China space, a really interesting thing happened in that Xi Jinping decided to skip the G20 meeting this year. And at the time, it was seen by a lot of pro-China, China watchers as kind of an alpha move and maybe a harbinger or an indicator of where Xi wants to take the world order and how he might want to reimagine it. There was a lot of speculation that he was doing this to emphasize other bilateral and multilateral relationships with other countries and sort of deprioritize or try to signal, things like BRICS might be more an important part of the future than perhaps something like the G20. I thought this was a really interesting snub at the time, and I had sort of looked into it to try to think about how I wanted to analyze it for this channel. And then the G20 happened, and in a side meeting, an interesting development happened that I think kind of impacted my thinking on what Xi Jinping had done. And that thing that happened was the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor was agreed to by Italy, France, Germany, the United States, Saudi Arabia, India. I think Israel is also, I don't know if they were a signatory at the G20, but they're heavily involved. And I think there's also been communication with the Jordanians to re-up or reinvest in some railroads in Jordan as well. And this corridor, the IMEC, is really a sea, rail, energy and telecommunications infrastructure investment project that aims to really reconnect or further connect India to Europe through this Middle East channel. And given a lot of the logistics and shipment issues in the Suez Canal that we've seen recently, and the cost, frankly, of getting ships through the Suez, that's part of what this IMEC is designed to address. There's quite a bit of goods and services, well, really goods that can be shipped by rail that can be a more efficient way to transport stuff often than getting through a choke point like that in these big, slow cargo vessels. Additionally, I think it has to be said that the warming of relations in the Arab world to Israel, generally, but specifically the Saudis and the Jordanians with Israel is a big part of, and the United Arab Emirates with Israel is a big part of what's going on here, right? This was sort of a geopolitical development that wouldn't have been possible a few years ago. So as those changes are happening in the region, I think this is a part of an outgrowth of that. I think it's a really interesting project. I think from what I can tell, it's a lot of OECD countries. It looks to be more, I think it's obviously logistically and sort of technically a counter to some of the infrastructure investment we've seen with the One Belt, One Road initiative. It also obviously kind of signals India perhaps growing closer with sort of the Western Alliance and the rules-based world order, and perhaps the sort of rationalization of that. Obviously, India kind of goes its own way in international relations, and I expect that to continue, but this certainly is a big step towards the West in a lot of ways. And because these IMEC investments will follow OECD and Blue Dot standards, this is sort of the countervailing. I mean, this is part of what my dissertation was on, so I could talk about this for days, and admittedly, it's pretty boring stuff. But the Blue Dot and the OECD way of doing international investment really centers around open bidding and procurement. It centers around open bidding for insuring projects. It focuses on transparency for all these procurement decisions. It focuses on environmental assessments that are done to a more rigorous level than perhaps the way the Chinese do them. And it focuses on, the supply of labor and parts and equipment for these projects. All this stuff sort of has to happen in an open and transparent way. This sort of investment standard sort of shies away from concessions, regulatory concessions, and things like that Chinese investments often kind of, you might get a great deal on the interest rate for some of these Chinese investments, say in a wind farm or a dam in Pakistan or something, but you end up giving up a lot of the regulatory control that a government would normally expect to have over that process. And so you end up kind of tying yourself to one supplier and one labor supplier, that kind of thing. So there's kind of two different ways of doing this, and I maybe can make another video about this in the future. Like I said, it's pretty inside baseball stuff, but it's important, right? Because these projects end up, they can be incredibly important for the development of a country. They can be incredibly important in terms of human safety and health, environmental standards, right? All these things end up being really important down the road after something gets built. And so I thought this was, obviously, like a lot of folks watching this, okay, this is an interesting move by several of these countries in the G20, is an interesting move by the Biden administration to kind of put money where his mouth is. And as someone who's watched the international investment space and studied the Belt and Road Initiative and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor in particular for many years, and watched it kind of be the only option in town in a lot of these parts of the world, I think this is a great move to sort of increase competitiveness in the international investment, infrastructure investment kind of environment. And even from sort of a nonpartisan perspective, I think the more competition we have in that venue, the better. You know, the more capital can be supplied to developing countries like India from different providers, right? The better it is for human development writ large, right? I think China and the United States getting in a competitive race to, invest effectively and massively in the developing world, it would be a great thing for the developing world. That's obviously a very general statement, but it's something I think is probably true. One of the interesting outcomes, though, from this IMEC announcement that I noticed on Twitter, it went from one part of my expertise, from my doctoral expertise, which was sort of this international investment policy stuff, and it kind of segued interestingly into, because my dissertation was weird, and I ended up focusing initially on Chinese investment, but then moved on to looking more at disinformation and doing more data science-y type things. Looking at election interference in the United States and those kinds of things, extremism online. And this sort of shifted to my other area that I'm really interested in, which is, you could call it disinformation, but information propagation in social media. And the way that happened with the IMEC, this corridor project, was some of the really well-known pro-China handles and personas on Twitter, like the Arnaud Bertrands of the world, started pushing this map of the IMEC and pointing out, how laughable it was as a project, because it utilized the port of Piraeus in Greece as one of its key transshipment nodes. To deliver, these goods from India to the heart of the European Union. And I saw this map and I thought, well, that's interesting. I mean, Piraeus is well known as being majority owned by a subsidiary, a private subsidiary of a Chinese state-owned firm called COSCO. And I thought that was an interesting choice if that was, what the official map was showing was true. Spoiler alert, it isn't necessarily true, but the first part of this actually that I thought was really interesting was a lot of these personas that push for kind of pro-China, blindly pro-China topics and discourse were noting that, this was laughable, this IMEC corridor was laughable because Piraeus is owned by China, basically, is how they were saying. This is a Chinese-owned port. I thought this was interesting because these are the same folks who often refer to companies like Huawei as, being legitimately private, right? And so when it suits them, it's, your data is safe with Huawei. This isn't the Chinese government. This is a private company in China. Chinese private companies are private. Kind of that's the talking point. But then, sort of talking out of two sides of your mouth if you then switch to, I want to claim the port of Piraeus as, owned by China, even though it's obviously owned by its majority owned by a private Chinese company that is ultimately a subsidiary, like most Chinese companies are, of a Chinese state-owned enterprise, or SOE. So it's my contention that there really aren't, of the big players in the Chinese, private sector. There's not really, it doesn't really work that way. It's not, it varies situation by situation, but all these companies operate, at the behest, or at least with the permission of the Chinese Communist Party. And if you dig into them, often, Costco is a good example. There's a private firm that owns most of this port in Greece, but it's ultimately owned by a Chinese state-owned enterprise that was set up in the 70s by the Chinese government to do a certain thing. So that was sort of the first point, is like this complicates, again, our idea about what is a private Chinese company. But the more interesting thing, I think, from a data science perspective and sort of a disinformation perspective, was that this map that was circulating, saying that this Piraeus port was the transshipment point, one of the key transshipment points for this IMEC corridor, is not an official map from IMEC. It's not in the Memorandum of Understanding from the signatories. It was nowhere in any of the official announcements from the White House or anybody else. So it's really interesting, because there are no official route designations for IMEC, and if you look into it, they're going to make them, but they haven't made them yet. Greece wasn't a direct signatory on the deal, right? Italy is, and Italy has similarly sized ports, maybe slightly smaller, but it would be a perfectly fine place to do it. And it may end up being through Piraeus, and there may be something else that I'm missing here. But it was really interesting, because if you start to dig into this, there was a guy, Professor Michael Tanchum was his name, and he's, as far as I can tell, a rigorous scholar in this field, and he wrote a paper a few years ago on the proposed idea of doing something like this IMEC corridor. He was talking about it sort of in generalities as something that might emerge in the future, and he was prescient in that prediction. And this was all these analytics that are coming out about this map. This is all really from his analysis. This was picked up in the Indian media in particular, because there was a lot of interest in this prediction, because this is something that a lot of Indian analysts are interested in and think would be really useful to their economy. So I'll link his work, in the description of this video, because I think it's a good read. But it's important to kind of, again, always remind ourselves, especially with profiles that we know to be pushing consistently media that align with one strategic actor's interests, in this case China's interests, that we need to be really careful to dig into that next level on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok or whatever it is, and say, is that actually, what's happening here? I mean, is this map a legitimate? And it was interesting because the map has no citations. It's never, connected to anything. It's one of those things where the human mind, and I even fall into it, where it's like, oh, there's a map. It must be a real map, right? My initial read is, well, the map, this person's putting the map on Twitter. It's obviously connected to what they're talking about. We kind of, who knows if that was even an intentional, act of disinformation. They may have just been, misled in these sort of same ways that I was by your initial kind of flawed human, dot connecting and that kind of reasoning that we do so quickly without even thinking about it. So again, it's something to keep in mind as we look forward in the IMEC, how it will emerge, and I'll probably make a follow-up video on that. But to circle back to my original desire to make the video about the G20 meeting to begin with, once this IMEC thing emerged, because I had originally been thinking, okay, Xi Jinping, maybe he is trying to send a message here, right? Maybe he's trying to send a message about BRICS and about G20, and that's why he's sitting this out. Now I think it's actually much more likely that what he was doing was, in a sort of classic way, trying to save face and not be stuck in at this G20 summit while this huge multilateral infrastructure investment agreement is happening, without him being there, right? This would be a really embarrassing look for him and not serve his interests. So I think in retrospect, it's actually much more likely that he didn't skip the G20 meeting, that he skipped it not because he wanted to look like an alpha, but he skipped it because he wanted to avoid the bad optics. The one other option is there's been so many high-level military and foreign affairs shakeups happening in the PRC lately, the anti-corruption campaign kicking up in the military and in the foreign affairs offices. I'm also, there's a distant third sort of option here, which is he's just got a lot of stuff on his hands domestically and is too busy, with those issues at home to be doing something like the G20 right now. So I'm really curious for y'all's thoughts about which of those three options you think it is. Is this Xi Jinping sending a message about the future of the world order? Is it him being preoccupied at home with distractions in terms of kind of purging people through the anti-corruption campaign, or is this more just he wanted to save face and didn't want to look like the odd man out in this IMEC agreement? So really curious for y'all's thoughts on it, and as always, really appreciate you tuning in and looking forward to the next one. Thanks.